Hello and welcome to this, my very first interactive fiction video. My name is Victor Gijsbers and what I want to do in this first video is I want to analyze for you a very short piece of interactive fiction. I want to talk about 905 by Adam Cadre. Adam Cadre is a well-known, indeed a prominent author of interactive fiction who did most of his work around the year 2000, publishing games like Photopia, as well as Varicella, although he also published a very well-received game called Endless Nameless much more recently in 2012. 905 was published in the year 2000. It's probably not Cadre's best game. That would be one of the games I mentioned previously. But it's maybe his most played game, precisely because it is so short, so satisfying, so interesting. If you want to recommend a 5 or 10 minute piece of interactive fiction, especially parser interactive fiction, to someone, then 905 is something that comes to mind immediately. Now, I want to stress that what I'm going to do here is not streaming this game, right? I'm not going to play through it. You're not going to look over my shoulder as I play it and, find out what it's all about. I have played it. I have thought about it. I'm going to analyze it. That means that this video is going to be chock full of spoilers, right? One of the first things I'm going to do in a minute or so is completely spoil the plot twist of 905. So if you want to play this game, this is the point where you click the stop or pause button and start playing it and return later once you've played it. So let's start by looking at the very beginning of the game. Here's are the first lines of 905. The phone rings. Oh no, how long have you been asleep? Sure, it was a tough night, but this is bad. This is very bad. The phone rings. And then we have the title of the game, the description of the room where you are in your bed, and it ends by saying, once again, the phone rings. So what is achieved by this phrase, the phone rings, that comes up again and again, that the player will have read already 3 times before they even type in a single command? Well, obviously what it does is it creates a sense of urgency, right? There's a phone ringing. You need to pick it up. What we see here is a technique that is incredibly important in our understanding of parser-based interactive fiction. You can think of traditional fiction, parser-based fiction and choice-based fiction as forming a kind of continuum in terms of freedom. If I'm reading a traditional book, I just have to read on, right? There's no way for me to influence what appears in the text. If I read a choice-based story, then I have, at several points during the story, multiple options, right? I can choose to click A or B or C. In a parser-based game, finally, I can type anything I want. Right now, of course, we know that only a finite number of commands will actually be recognized by the parser. We know that an even smaller number of commands will actually move the story forward. But when I'm looking at that command prompt, when I can type anything that I want, that's a lot of freedom. And it generates much of the experience of freedom that comes from playing parser-based games. But of course, if you give freedom to your reader, then you also need to give them something else, right? You need to give them the ability to use that freedom. And what is especially important there is that the player needs a certain kind of clarity. They need to know what they ought to be doing, right? They need some kind of goal. They need some kind of sense of what should be happening, what the protagonist should be doing, so that they can come up with the right kinds of commands to type into the parser and move the story forward. And so where a novel can get away with even an incomprehensible opening scene, certainly an opening scene in which we know almost nothing about the protagonist, about their aims, about what they're going to do, until the moment that it happens. Parser-based interactive fiction, on the other hand, has to establish almost immediately, at least partially, a kind of goal, a kind of action, context for the protagonist, so that the player can interact with it. That's what 905 obviously is doing here, right? It's describing you as lying in your bed, but it's also giving you this ringing phone. What does that do? Well, it tells you, the player, what you ought to be doing, right? You ought to be picking up that phone. In fact, 905 has been carefully designed to always give the player a very, very clear plan of action. You will immediately pick up the phone. As soon as you have picked up the phone, you will know what to do next. You know that you're late for work, you know that you need to get dressed, that you need to take a shower, that you need to breakfast, that you need to get into the car and drive to work to get this particular form in your boss's office as soon as possible. So the plan is totally laid out for you. It's made almost too easy for the player, but at least there's the clarity, right? You can act, you can type in the commands that you need to type in to move the story forward. Now, of course, what Cadre is doing in 905 is he is playing an interesting, one could say even devious game, with the difference between, on the one hand, player knowledge and on the other hand, character knowledge. All these things that I've been pointing out, all this entire plan of action, is something that the player picks up and that the player is going to believe is the plan of action that the protagonist, the player character, will also have, will also want to perform. But of course 905 is set up precisely in such a way that that's not true. That the actual motivation for the player character is or should be completely different from the motivation that is suggested by all of the game's pros. After all, you should not be picking up that phone, right? It's not your phone, it's the phone of the guy who actually owns this apartment, who is lying dead beneath the bed, whom you killed yesterday as you broke into his apartment in order to steal the television. And the last thing you should be doing is taking his car, driving to his office and trying to perform his day job. Rather, you need to get the hell out of here. So 905, well, for everybody who plays it, of course, the first time you play it, you go along with these genre conventions, right? In fact, you don't really have any other choice than going along with these genre conventions, right? As a player of parser-based interactive fiction, you're always relying on the author to tell you or hint to you what you should be doing, what kind of action you should be taking. And here Cadre is hinting something very strongly that turns out at the end to be, from the point of view of the protagonist, a very stupid course of action. And once that has been revealed, which is of course the delightful plot twist, once that has been revealed, you can restart the game and play it again with this new knowledge, set out your own plan for action, and get away with your crime, instead of, facing life imprisonment or something unpleasant like that. So what 905 does, one would say, is it shines the spotlight onto, well, two things. First of all, this need for interactive fiction, for parser-based interactive fiction especially, to clarify a plan of action for the player. And second, on the divide between, on the one hand, the player and on the other hand, the player character. It's almost a joke that Cadre is performing with us. We are, to some extent, the butt of the joke, but once we realize what's going on, we can then replay the game and laugh about all the little details that, weren't strong enough to give the game away to us when we saw them at first, but realizing that already our very first actions could have totally changed the situation, could have revealed that we were actually in a very different fiction from the one that we thought we were, right? All you have to do is type "look under bed" in the first room, and suddenly the story changes totally. But of course nobody does that. No first-time player looks under the bed, because it's not hinted for a second that you want to look under the bed, that there's something there, that is something that you need to do. There's a second aspect of 905 that I want to spend a little time talking about, and that's the fact that it's very fiddly. Right? As you try to do these mundane chores within the apartment that you find yourself in, it turns out that the parser is pretty finicky. It wants you to specify every little step of every action. You can't just take shower. If you type take shower, it tells you that you first need to take off your clothes. So you take off your clothes. If you then try to take a shower, it tells you to take off your watch. So you take off your watch. If you then try to take a shower, it tells you that you are still carrying your clothes and your watch. And that's not very, a wise thing to do if you step into a shower. So you have to drop them and so on. It's very finicky. It's very fiddly. This is the kind of thing that a good author of interactive fiction would normally smooth away, right? We would normally write a game in such a way that if somebody tries to take the shower, tries to clean themselves, the game would automatically assume that, you want to take off your clothes first and so on, and just skip those steps. So what's going on here? Well, one possibility is that the author of this game doesn't know how to smooth the game experience. And this could be true if this were a work by an inexperienced author, but it isn't, right? Cadre had already written several very good works of interactive fiction by this point. So it must be intentional. I think what it does is two things, right? First of all, it kind of recreates the psychological state in which the protagonist finds themselves, right? It recreates this psychological state of having just been woken up, being disoriented. Now you have to do these tasks and everything goes a little bit wrong, right? You have to think about everything, even these mundane tasks, because you are so sleepy and so surprised and so grogged maybe, that everything takes more effort than it usually does. But the second thing that it does, even more importantly, is it irritates the player, right? It makes things go slow. And if things go slow, you want them to speed up, right? So what you're not going to do is you're not going to take the extra time to examine everything, do things like looking under the bed, right? The interface is so fiddly that you're like, okay, I want to get out of this apartment already. Why are you delaying me? And so what it does is it kind of swallows your attention, right? It kind of ensures that you're not going to spend the extra time exploring the situation that you might otherwise take. And so it ensures that you don't really find out what's going on until you have finished your first playthrough of the game, arrived at the office, and get this weird plot twist ending that you didn't see coming, which is, of course, pretty much a necessity for the game to work as the joke that it definitely also is. So 905, it's a very interesting little game, not just fun to play, but we can learn something from analyzing it about the way that interactive fiction in general and parser interactive fiction in particular works. So thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll be able to make more of them in the future.